2 minutes before I walk onto a stage that will be streaming to millions, I will laugh. It will sound like a small, private laugh at first, the kind you make when you know something nobody else in the room knows. Then I will do something that will make that laugh stop being private forever. I am telling you this at the start because I want you to feel the animal pull in your chest that has been living inside me for 27 years. I want you to imagine the lights, the applause, the man everyone thinks built an empire, and the way the room will turn suddenly, shuddering when the truth lands. But for now I am here, at my kitchen table with paint on my knuckles and a mug that has never held anything but cheap black coffee, and I will tell you how I got to that stage and why there is no going back. My brother Jamie wears sunglasses even at night and a wardrobe that costs more than my first car. He walks into rooms like he invented oxygen and people orbit him because he laughs like a GIF. He is the face of a multi-million-dollar design brand, the one with glossy magazine spreads and hotels named after him, the one who goes on talk shows and says nonsense lines about authentic vision that everyone applauds. The truth most of them would not believe if I whispered it into their ears is that every pattern, every installation, every viral product credited to Jamie came from my hands. I drew the sketches, I built the models, I rewrote the artist's statements that made people cry in press releases. I was the engine and he was the salesman steering the car. Our parents clapped the whole time. We were twins born under one roof that smelled like lemon oil and old paperbacks, and from the beginning our roles were assigned like cast parts in a small town play. I was the quiet one who loved to take things apart and put them back in better ways. Jamie was loud and the world liked his noise. When mom and dad saw the pattern, my sketches in the margins of my school books, Jamie charming the teacher into believing his hand had done the work, they made a decision, not a cruel one in their eyes. "We are helping both of you," they said like those words could justify everything. They made me help him. They framed it as love and sacrifice and family business. And when I was young, I believed them because love looks a lot like an arrangement when it has been normalized over breakfast conversations and holiday photos. It was not a single theft. It was a lifetime of small handovers that grew into something monstrous. I did the science fair models, the college portfolio pieces, the first hotel foyer installation that landed Jamie on the front page, and a contract with a real estate investor who smelled possibility. I did it because my father taught me to be useful and my mother taught me that loyalty was sacred. I did it because I wanted my brother to have what I thought he deserved. A life with applause where his empty confidence could be cushioned by my skill. The applause grew louder and more expensive. The checks stopped coming to me. Instead, they were photographed for Instagram, circled by PR teams, and written about as if they were the product of some rare charisma that only Jamie could channel. I'm not built from rage alone. I am built from small humiliations and the salt they left behind. I remember Jamie's first big speech where he called our parents and me on stage as if to honor us. He said I couldn't have done this without my family and kissed his mother's cheek while the audience hooted. My mother leaned forward like a queen and whispered to me, "See, we raised him right." I walked home after that night and sold the last painting I owned to keep the electricity from getting cut off. I watched the videos of Jamie accepting awards from hotel lobbies I had designed and listened to pundits credit him for ideas he could not possibly understand. People wrote think pieces about charisma as art and the myth of the genius. Nobody asked the ghost under the paintings if he felt cold. Secretly, stupidly, proudly, I had always left tiny marks under my work. A crooked stitch, a hidden triangle of brush strokes, a particular way of signing the back of a paper that only I would notice and remember. Over the years, those marks became a private language with myself, proof that the work came from somewhere human and specific and mine. I never expected to need them like an exhale of evidence. But when the betrayal tightened like a noose and the bills piled up on my kitchen table, those little marks turned into tools. The plan I began sketching on napkins between freelance gigs and late-night orders at a diner started to look less like a fantasy and more like destiny. If I was the shadow who had shaped a career, I would stop being a shadow. I would step into light on my own terms, and when I did it would be loud enough that no one could ever say they didn't know. When the landlord finally put the eviction notice on my door, I laughed for a different reason than the stage laugh. It was the hollow laugh of someone who has been taught to forgive debts with patience and quiet until the ledger itself starts to look like a joke. For months I had been living in the margins. Freelance gigs that paid in handshake promises, a mailroom temp job that kept some lights on, the sale of a beloved prototype to pay for a winter I could not heat. I had stopped answering old friends because they had become the kind of people who saw my name under artist and assumed I was doing fine. I had been scraping the bottom of every can of dignity I had and still found the taste of salt. That month the bills felt like accusation. I went to them because there was nowhere else to go, not to the tabloids, not to a lawyer yet. I went to the two people who had been authors of my life story, my parents who had folded me into a family myth and Jamie who carried that myth into penthouses. I wanted something small that was fair. I wanted an acknowledgement that would let me say to the bank, to the landlord, to the barista who had started recognizing me that I existed in the line that made the money. We met at the summer house my parents rented now that their bank account had expanded like a horizon. It smelled of lemon and expensive polish. They had bought a sculpture Jamie designed for their living room that I had handcrafted years before. I sat at their kitchen island across from the glossy man who looked nothing like the boy who used to eat cereal with me, who would carve my drawings into toy planes and call me genius with a lisp. Jamie's smile was the one that courted sponsors and cameras. Up close it was small and perfect like a product staged in a studio. Just 5%, I said, because I had practiced possibilities and settled on a number that wouldn't break the brand but might fix the hole under my feet. I said it like someone asking for a cigarette, casual but needing it. 5%, public credit, name on the website, something that says I existed in the thing you made money from. They listened like they were listening to a script they had seen 100 times, the kid who finally wanted payment. My mother busied herself with placing a napkin, the old ritual that always came with words meant to soften knives. My father folded his hands the way a man folds a map he's already read. Jamie leaned back and let the grin do the work until it froze into something meaner. 5%, my father said, voice like linen. Do you really think this is about percentages? We gave you everything if you remember. We fed you with purpose. We taught you how to be useful. You got to learn the craft, you learned manners, you learned not to make a scene. We raised a boy who could sell what you made. That is the business model, not a crime. My mother reached across the table and touched my hand as if the contact were medicine. Her eyes were wet and sharp. People buy the myth more than the object, she said. Jamie is the myth, you are the labor, it's how the world works. You chose that life. I remember the way my chest folded then, like a page turned slowly and unread. I told them about the nights alone in the workroom, about sketches moth-eaten from use, about the time my rent was 3 days past and the man at the door had threatened to change the locks. I told them how Jamie's agents flew in with champagne and old friends who pretended to have made his rise by accident. I told them how the press wrote about a visionary and never once mentioned the crooked stitch I left under the seam of the first hotel curtain, the little secret that made that whole room feel lived in. Jamie laughed. It wasn't a sudden sound, it tumbled out like a well-rehearsed line. You always dramatize, he said. You know we can't function with two mouths. The brand needs a face. I am that face. The fact that you can make the product is lovely. But a brand is a promise and a promise is sold with personality. Don't be ridiculous. Do you want credit or do you want chaos? They spoke to me like I was a family heirloom that had outlived its usefulness and could be recycled into a more profitable thing. They spoke of image and market positioning as if I had invented neither hunger nor hands. When I named specific pieces I had created, when I pulled out a battered sketchbook from my bag, the one that had my oldest drafts and a tiny crumbling note where Dad once wrote, "Proud," my mother snatched it from my hands like retrieving something embarrassing. You keep living in these fantasies, she said, flipping pages the way someone flips a coin. People need a story they can buy, Jamie tells it. You tell a different one and the world doesn't give you money for honesty. Jamie offered me a job, a word I heard and swallowed like a bone. Designer in residence, he said, like handing me a title that came with no salary and no name on a tag. We'll put your initials somewhere in the credits if you behave. You'll be taken care of. We can make this graceful. I had made my life graceful by furnished sacrifices. I had imagined a bank account with my name on it, not a title as gesture. When I asked for the small thing, 5%, a line on a website, a public nod, they looked at me as if I had asked them to auction the moon. They laughed at the idea that I would take them to court. Lawyers cost money, and witnesses who remember the back room where ideas gestated would have to choose a side. No one will believe you over the story we've already told, Jamie said. And even if they do, what will you prove? That you were handy, that you were a good little helper. No one buys hands, they buy faces. They pushed me out gently the way a surgeon closes an incision. My mother kissed my cheek and whispered, "We'll always be family," as if the word family could be used to erase a ledger. I walked out with my sketchbook and a hollow promise of a title in my pocket. Outside, the winter was the same indifferent gray it had always been. I had asked for a sliver of the life I built and been told instead that I had always been nothing but shadow. The thing that hurt was not that they laughed. It was that they believed they were being reasonable. Back at my small kitchen table, the eviction note is still on the counter. I opened the sketchbook. Between the pages I found the tiny marks I had left over the years, the crooked stitch, the slanted triangle, the signature hidden in a negative space. They sat there indifferent and patient like witnesses waiting to be called. I looked at them, and for the first time a plan began to take shape in the way raw things sometimes do, messy, dangerous, and inevitable. The announcement hit like an earthquake on a Tuesday. Jamie Live on a morning show with coffee and a grin, promising the biggest thing he'd ever done, a masterpiece that would redefine cities and be talked about for generations. His PR team sold it as a cultural reset, a floating pavilion that would tour harbors around the world, a sculptural hotel that would host presidents and influencers and be the backdrop for every wedding video in several countries. The network ran a glossy teaser, and the comments filled with emojis and worship. I watched it in my living room with my sketchbook open on my knees and the eviction notice still face down on the table. The laugh I had promised myself the night before felt like a distant plan, not a tool I could reach for yet. I felt sick instead because I knew every surface of that shiny project already. I had built a smaller version of the pavilion on my kitchen table years ago, the prototype that Jamie sold to a developer who later told his board it had the Jamie touch. They made the call as if they were offering me charity. 2 days after the announcement, Jamie called me and asked me to come by the studio. He sounded casual, the way a butcher might ask someone to stop by for a favor. When I arrived, there were renders on the wall, photographs polished so bright they hurt, of a structure that folded like a paper bird. There were engineers, model makers, consultants who used words I had used before but with less grime on them. A PR woman handed me a folder, a contract with nice fonts and clauses designed to make generosity feel like mercy. "Last time," Jamie said, smiling that famous smile like a kid promising he would eat only one cookie. "After this, you can relax. We will figure out the rest. This is the peak. One mountain, then you can be proud from the valley." My mother was there, wearing the same pale scarf she used when she wanted to look like she'd been to a gallery. My father clasped my shoulder like a man who buys insurance and calls it love. They watched me as if my expression were a product prototype as well, something to be judged and discarded. Jamie laid out the terms. I would be the hands. I would create the models, the textures, the minute details that would convince critics this was genius. I would sign nothing public. I would not be credited beyond a line in the press release no one reads. In return, I would be paid a flat fee that would keep me solvent for a few months and taken care of afterward. He promised there would be a plaque somewhere small, maybe in the service corridor, and he would mention me in a speech if I didn't make him uncomfortable by being petty. It was the final insult because it was everything I had fought tooth and nail to avoid being. It was not an ask, it was a demand wrapped in the language of mercy. He framed it like a favor, a last exploit before my body of work retired into the wood and dust of someone else's life. He promised me air and then handed me a cage. He told me the world needed a face and he was offering to put a matchstick of recognition into my palm in case I wanted to light it, as if I hadn't spent the last decades weathering storms to earn even a matchstick. "Please," I said, because sometimes the gutter is loud and asking for a small thing sounds like bargaining with a god. "Please put my name, I just need proof." Jamie shrugged and the room laughed like a wave. My mother said softly, like reciting a prayer, "Names are for people who need them. We gave you everything else." My father said, "Don't make trouble. This is your chance to be part of something bigger." The engineers talked about tolerances and load-bearing calculations, words that have always felt to me like maps to a locked room I built in my sleep. The PR woman told me the narrative: hero, entrepreneur, visionary. I was the craftsman in the shadows, the man with the hammer whose name would be small in a press release, and that would be my lot. The thing that made me angrier than the words was the manner of the ask. He expected me to be grateful for the role he had already assigned me. He expected me to bend because our parents had taught me to. He offered me what he thought the world owed me, crumbs and a line about being taken care of. But the project, the pavilion, was also the perfect stage. It would be built in public spaces, streamed, photographed, lit. It would be full of cameras and sensors, the kind of technology that could be hacked if you knew how to speak to it. My hands would have access to the inner surfaces, the core modules that no one else would touch. If I was going to be used, I would use my use. If I was going to be a ghost, I would haunt the place in a way they couldn't remove. I said yes, not because I trusted Jamie or because I believed in the promise of being taken care of. I said yes because it was the only way to get inside the machine that had turned my life into someone else's trophy. I packed my sketchbook back into my bag, the one with the hidden marks between the pages, and I walked out into the cold with a plan forming like a bruise. They thought they were closing a deal. They thought they were finally buying my compliance. They didn't know I had been stitching evidence into every seam for years, and I was about to thread those stitches together in public with their cameras on. I said yes, and then I began lying like an actor until the curtain rose. I smiled at Jamie, I nodded at the engineers, I signed the polite little contract that smelled faintly of someone else's victory, and I walked back to the small room I called a studio, and started turning everything I knew about creation into weapons. It felt filthy and holy at the same time. Filthy because I was using their trust against them. Holy because I had decided the truth mattered more than any apology I would never get. The pavilion was complex, an architecture of folded skins and hidden ribs, but it was also predictable if you knew how things were put together. That was my advantage. Over 2 decades, I had developed habits that showed up in every sketch and model. The way my pencil curved when I rounded a corner, the particular chaos of my layer names in digital files, the tiny asymmetry I introduced into tiles because I liked things that felt lived in. Those mistakes were fingerprints. I had left them on school projects, on the curtains that hung in boutique hotels, on the table where Jamie photographed for spreads. Nobody else had noticed them or nobody else had cared. Now I would make them scream my name. I built my signature in layers like a trap. The first layer was physical, almost invisible deviations in the CNC toolpaths and the rivet patterns that, if mapped, formed my initials in a spiral. I had to be subtle. The contractors were sticklers for tolerance. I made the spiral tiny, buried it under a maintenance panel, and told myself it was a child's game. The second layer was digital, and here I spent nights scribbling code at a tiny desk lamp until the coffee stained the notes. I wrote a small program that would analyze 3D geometry and decode the pattern of my pencil lifts translated into vertex normals. The program would output a string. The string matched a hash I had already uploaded to a decentralized archive weeks earlier. Nobody could claim I hadn't created that hash first. The third layer was photographic. I started a ritual of shooting process footage in a way that couldn't be faked. Long takes with an old film camera I kept because it recorded a mechanical timestamp on the sprocket. I filmed my hands shaping clay, my breath fogging the lens when I leaned too close, the exact shake of my wrist when I signed a tiny corner of foam. I recorded screen sessions at full resolution with raw inputs, the cursor path imprinted like a handwriting analyzer. Each file had metadata, timestamps, system logs, hardware IDs that traced back to the battered laptop on my kitchen table. I uploaded those to multiple servers, to cloud accounts with innocuous names, to a private Git I locked with a passphrase only I and 2 people knew. I am not a hacker, but I know people who are, and I learned fast that you do not go into battle alone. There was Nina, the engineer who used to route cables for Jamie's shows until she quit because he never listened to the people who built his stage. She believed me immediately when I showed her the misaligned rivet pattern I had placed. She showed me how to register the pattern as an object in the pavilion's control software so that a diagnostic scan would produce data I could use as proof. There was Theo, a barista who built indie apps on nights off and swore at the corporate world every chance he got. He helped me seed my archive to IPFS and notarize the master hash on multiple blockchains, the sort of ugly poetry that guarantees something cannot be quietly erased. I sent physical parcels containing original sketchbooks and letters to a university archive and to an investigative journalist with a spine I admired. Each parcel had a code that matched the digital hash. The links to each other were the thing that made it harder to deny. I also made a personal choice that felt like the biggest gamble. I embedded a voice sample of my mother and father into an ambient track that would play during the pavilion's soft opening. Years earlier, in a tape I had made and saved, my father had praised Jamie's instinct while my mother said how proud they were. Those clips, taken out of context and paired with images of the original sketches, would sound like propaganda if someone tried to gaslight the truth. It was cruel, yes, but their own voices had helped build the lie for years. I would let them finish it by being honest. Then there were the backups, because hope without redundancy is just fantasy. I printed my oldest pages, had them fed into scanners that stamped university timestamps, and sent them to 3 different lawyers anonymously with instructions to hold them until release. I set up a timed release of everything to go live the moment I pushed a single button. The button sat on my phone in a hidden folder named after a grocery list. There were fail-safes and fail-safers. If one server caught a cold, another would sneeze into the open and the press would pick it up. Working on Jamie's pavilion felt like being in 2 lives at once. During the day, I shaped tiles and tweaked light maps, pretending pleasure as the contractors praised the visionary. At night, I stitched evidence together like a seamstress who had learned how to hide truth inside hems. The most dangerous part of it was watching Jamie walk through the model rooms and talk about the way light made people feel as if he had invented feeling. He would touch a corner I had rounded and talk about the emotion of it as if the world were a cheap book and he had written the title. I swallowed the urge to correct him and instead photographed his fingers on the surface, metadata preserved, so that later the world could see the man who posed with other people's hands. There were moments of doubt. I imagined what would happen if I were discovered before the reveal, if they pulled me into a room and stripped my pockets of proof. I pictured my parents' faces, the way they had folded guilt into virtue, and I wondered if any of this would break them in new ways I could not put back together. But in the quiet hours when the city hummed and the studio smelled like turpentine, I would open my sketchbook and run my thumb over the tiny triangle I had drawn on the back of a napkin when I was 20. It was my first mark, and it still told me who I was. The slow rebellion was complete when I stood in the belly of the finished pavilion and flicked the maintenance panel closed over the tiny spiral of rivets. I felt a satisfaction like setting a trap as I walked away. I had left them a perfect work of beauty to sell and a perfect storm of evidence to sink them with. I had done it without shouting, without breaking anything that could be fixed. It was quiet, patient, and precisely unfair in the way revenge needs to be. Now all that remained was to choose when to let the sun in. The night tasted like metal and 1,000 borrowed breaths. The pavilion sat on the water like a white animal, its skin glittering under spotlights until it looked unreal, like someone had dressed a cloud for a gala. They had rolled it out with the kind of choreography that convinced people to forget how much was machine and how much was myth. Drones buzzed above us like curious flies, their cameras blinking. Giant screens floated over the crowd, splitting the world into high-definition pieces that meant nothing if you were standing in the audience with your hands shoved in your pockets. I had a suit on that did not fit right and a pass on a lanyard that said contractor. It was a lie I wore because it let me breathe backstage and move through corridors they thought I had no place in. It was a good lie and a cheap shirt, and I was counting the seconds. Jamie appeared to applause that sounded like currency. It was the kind of noise people make when they have already decided to love someone. He walked out like a man with a story everyone already wanted to buy, and he drank the room with the confidence of someone who has never had to open a ledger. He wore a jacket with sleeves cut so perfectly they made the cameras fall in love. His smile was warm and rehearsed. Up close he looked like the actor he had become, not the boy who used to copy my doodles onto his notebooks because he liked the look of having a drawing. There were celebrities, a senator, a head of some museum who clapped too slowly, and of course the influencers with phones held like offerings to the altar of attention. My parents sat in the third row under a box of light, their faces made of soft pride and gold teeth. My mother waved when she saw me, proud and unaware. And for a second I felt like a child at a school play handing up someone else's trophy. The covered masterpiece loomed beside Jamie like a sleeping titan. They had swathed it in fabric that caught the lights and made it move like muscle under skin. Cameras pointed, commentators whispered into earpieces, and a host who must have rehearsed his astonishment smiled like he was about to cry on cue. Jamie began to speak about journeys, about cities needing new myths, about the responsibility of beauty. He talked about his team, and he said the word visionary enough times that people started to believe the concept had weight. I watched his hands articulate things he had never modeled or even conceptualized. He told a story about how the pavilion was meant to comfort strangers and forge friendships across water, and the audience nodded like wood. Inside the belly of that thing were the small revolutions I had hidden, the spiral rivet, the vertex hash, the maintenance panel that no one would think to open on a night like this. I had installed them as a surgeon does stitches, hands moving with years' worth of muscle memory. My heart pounded in a rhythm that did not match the music. The control room where the technicians sat was a few doors away, lit in cold blues and red blinking lights. Theo was there, palms on a console, looking ridiculous in a tech shirt and an ugly grin that broke at the corners because he could not stop being proud. Nina had taken the lighting rig and was sitting with 2 cables wrapped around her arm like a champion. She mouthed 3 words to me when she saw me, ready on my count. The people I had trusted with this plan had faces like weather when they believed in something. There were 1,000 camera angles capturing everything, and I had planned for their hunger. The plan was not only to reveal the signature, but to do it in a way the public could not walk away from. When Jamie pulled the cloth, the world would see beauty and the world would receive a file. The file would carry a hash that matched the string I had already published to an immutable archive. The maintenance scan would show the spiral and a series of diagnostic logs I had tuned to output the timestamp geometry pattern. Once those two met on public servers and investigators had a trail, legal denial would be a language of shadows. I had set up lawyers to receive sealed packets at the exact minute, and an investigative journalist to watch feeds and verify that the hash appeared, to have a story ready before PR could spin. There was danger in the open air like static. Security walked like men who had been instructed to ignore anything the public does not need to know. At one point, a guard eyed me with the same suspicion a detective gives a familiar suspect, and I smiled like I had always belonged. I kept glancing at my mother and father, at Jamie mouthing lines about legacy. My father clapped as if watering a plant, pleased and naive. My mother wiped a tear and mouthed, "We did good." The me that had painted curtains and soldered tiny lights into chandeliers wanted to stand up and shout the truth into the speakers, to watch the microphones hush the audience as if someone had yanked down a curtain on a lie. But there is art to timing, and I had learned timing in the cold of the night when rent collectors had knocked. Outside the venue, the harbor was restless. The weather had turned meaner than they predicted, and a wind drove hard at the stage drapes. That wind made the techs nervous and the drones falter, and made me glad because nature is a chaotic ally to a messy plan. If the live stream hiccuped, backup streams would kick in and my posted hash would still be out there, indelible. I felt as if I were the last man to know a secret that could rewrite a life, and I held that secret like a coin in my palm. Jamie was about to pull the cloth, the exact moment when the cameras would flood images into servers and the world would drink in a story. I stood a little to the side, contractor pass cool against my chest, breath held, finger tracing the edge of a phone hidden in a pocket that hit a button. The room held its breath with me, and for the first time in a long time I felt the true weight of what I had built. Jamie takes a breath and the applause swells like ocean waves. His voice, the one the crowds know, reaches across the harbor and then the lights gutter, not with failure but with a purpose. For a second I think someone tripped a fuse, then the hosts fumble and the giant screens cut to black like closed eyes. The room murmurs and the sound of 1,000 cell phones clicks like crickets. I watch Jamie freeze mid-sentence, practiced hands pausing as if someone has taken his cues away. Behind the curtains, Theo's fingers are steady and Nina's face is a mask of calm fury. I have always believed in the theater of timing, and now the stage is mine. My face appears on every screen, not some shaky grainy clip but sharp, intimate, full frame. I look younger than the life they sold, hands still with a smudge of putty, thumb stained with graphite. I say 2 words and the sound cuts through the noise like a blade. I am the artist. I let the simple sentence hang because people need a beat to rearrange the story lumped inside their heads. The reaction is immediate, a few chuckles, a few confused looks, then the room grows quieter. Jamie's smile twists into suspicion. My mother reaches for my father's arm like there is a spear between us. I start with what no one can easily argue about. I let the camera hold the pages as I flip through my oldest sketchbook. The film sprockets of an old camera I used to track process click in the corner of the frame. You can see the edges curl, the coffee stain from my first paid job, the tiny triangle I drew when I was 19 and thought I was inventing nothing. I show the timestamps, the raw footage of my hands building the first model of this pavilion, and then methodically I upload the hash from the software I wrote. The stream pans to a window that shows the live diagnostic feed from the pavilion's maintenance server. The spiral rivet pattern I left is reading on the diagnostic as a geometry string. Theo feeds that string into a verifier, and it spits out the same hash I published weeks ago to a decentralized archive. The host stumbles to his feet, eyes hunting for an explanation that is not there. I play the videos in sequence, my hands kneading clay, the cursor movements on my old laptop as I model the very folds of the pavilion, the long take of me signing a tiny maintenance plate 3 years ago. Each clip has metadata baked in, timestamps, camera IDs, system logs. I watch faces in the crowd as the narrative rearranges itself with each new file. The investigative journalist I sent a sealed packet to 2 nights ago has already tweeted verification of the hash match and a URL to the archive. The stream floods with links and screenshots faster than PR can write a press release. Influencers in the front row whisper into their phones, and then they point them at screens that show the wrong story for Jamie. The cruelty I had stored up for years I use with a surgeon's hand. I play an audio clip where my mother, years earlier, tells a friend on a tape how she encouraged me to be useful and how Jamie was the face they were proud to show. My father's voice, clipped and avuncular in a home recording, brags about deals and how image moves money. You can see the color drain from their faces as their words hang in the air like witnesses. Jamie's eyes go from anger to fear so fast his face looks like a mask cracking. He mouths, "No," as if he can bargain with the pixels streaming the truth. They try to pull the feed. Security surges toward me like a pack, but they are too slow and too committed to choreography to act without orders. Theo has routed redundant streams through a dozen servers. Nina has overridden a local blackout with a looped clean feed. My pre-recorded legal packets open automatically the second the hash was verified, the sealed PDFs landing in the inboxes of journalists and a few law firms waiting with pens poised. Sponsors start to send terse, automated tweets with withdrawal language. A senator sitting in the third row stands and leaves without applause because reputation is weightier than loyalty when paper trails are on the table. In the middle of it all I walk forward and do the smallest, loudest thing I can. I take a marker and draw 3 strokes on a piece of foam held to the camera. It's the line I have made 1,000 times, the little asymmetry that is mine alone. The algorithm I wrote runs live and overlays that stroke onto a rendered section of the pavilion projected on the screen. The curve matches perfectly. The audience sees in real time my line fitting into the structure they are being told was invented by someone else. The broadcast shows Jamie's hand on a rope mid-motion as his exposed honesty unravels. Jamie tries to speak, to beg the cameras to show another angle, but the microphones cut him off as journalists on live feeds already read the contracts I uploaded that contain emails where he forwarded my work claiming authorship. There is a scuffle at the edge of the stage, a PR manager swearing into a phone, my mother fainting into my father's lap as the sound swells into a chorus of outrage, sympathy, and disbelief. I feel none of the dizzying triumph I expected. Instead, I am a man whose throat is tight from years of swallowing words. What comes out now is thin and clear. I tell the truth in sentences short enough to be quoted, and as each sentence lands, it is picked up and reprinted in the glowing run of phones and headlines. When the last clip plays, the very maintenance panel I installed slides open and the lights inside pulse once, designed to respond to an emergency diagnostic I set to a certain keystroke. The lights project a spiral across the pavilion's skin that, from the high drone angles beamed worldwide, resolves into my initials. For the first time, the world sees not just evidence but the signature that was always meant to be invisible. Jamie's knees give and he sinks into a chair, the king of a kingdom that realizes it has been built on borrowed hands. My parents cover their faces with their hands, the kind of sound people make when a story they have told themselves falls apart into truth. The room becomes a roaring animal of voices. Phones beam the footage into a million feeds. Lawyers in their offices already type subpoenas while PR teams try to write apologies that will no longer suffice. I stand on a stage I never wanted but always deserved, and the weight of everything I have lost and everything I am about to gain presses against my ribs like a second heart. The cameras find my face and I do not flinch. The world is watching, and for once there is nothing to hide behind. I told the host to stop talking and I walked to the edge of the stage like a man who had rehearsed this walk in his head every night he'd slept on a futon. My voice was quieter than the microphones expected, and that made people lean forward. I said plainly, "Technician, run diagnostic 37. It sounded like a technical command, and it was, but it also sounded like the beginning of a ritual. Theo's fingers hit a key and a new feed popped into the corner of the giant screens, a clean white window labeled Diagnostics. I asked for polarized lighting, and Nina, who had wired the rig I designed months ago, tilted the wavelength until the pavilion's skin turned from a pearl to a deep ink. That was the physical reveal I had hidden under years of contract tolerances. The rivet spiral I installed glowed darker than the surrounding metal and resolved, slowly, into a tiny double spiral that, from the drone's angles, began to read as letters. I lifted a maintenance plate I had prepared weeks ago and clipped it to the camera. The feed zoomed in and the spiral was there, like a fingerprint in brass. Then I asked Theo to overlay the hash verifier he'd run that morning. He typed a command and the verifier spit out the string I had seeded to the immutable archive. The string and the spiral matched. The host tried to say something about engineering marvels, but the crowd was already changing channels in their heads. I put the marker in my pocket and asked for the gallery mode. The technicians, trained to do what made the cameras look good, switched the feed to split screen, and I watched the studio move away like a tide. This is where I had planned the real trap. I asked Nina to feed the live projection into our app, the one Theo had thrown together in a panic over coffee. I asked the engineers to broadcast the app URL on the lower third of the screen so anyone watching from home could download it and point it at any image of Jamie's work. Within seconds, phones in the crowd were up, and the live feed started to show overlays on images of Jamie's pieces the world had seen for years. One by one, in front of a live audience and millions of strangers, signature after signature lit up on the screens. The tile pattern from the boutique hotel lobby pulsed with the same slanted triangle. The wallpaper repeat from that famous storefront glowed with my asymmetry. The ceramic handle from the limited edition product line revealed the same tiny off-center notch I always put in when turning clay. My marks were everywhere. I walked the cameras through each place like a tour guide showing a crime scene. I held up a photograph of the first hotel foyer I had made and ran my thumb across it to point at the seam where I'd tucked a hidden stitch 3 years earlier. The camera closed in, and you could see the irregularity with a microscopic clarity that ruined their stories. I played a clip of the old magazine spread where Jamie had posed in front of a couch I had designed. The overlay lit the exact same microasymmetry in the tufting that matched the curve I had just drawn on the foam at the start of the reveal. I said the truth out loud in short sentences like evidence. This was mine. This was my hand. People around me whispered the way they whisper in galleries when they realize a painting wasn't what it seemed. Jamie tried to laugh it off, the reflex of a man who had sold his entire life to performance. He raised his hands and called for calm, then pointed toward his PR, who started to speak the language of crisis management. My mother stood up and looked like someone whose house is burning and who still wants to water a potted plant. My father reached for the programs like a man who believes paper can fix things. But the images wouldn't unsee themselves, and when I switched the feed to show the timeline, my time-stamped files, my raw footage of modeling, my old camera sprocket footage next to current renders, people stopped pretending they didn't need to know more. I had one more move because evidence without context can be shrugged off as coincidence. I brought up an email thread live on the screens, the one where Jamie forwarded my files to his agent and wrote, "Looks great, make sure our name shines." It was a clear, crass line that showed intent. The room inhaled as the email scrolled, and then I played a short montage of collectors on the phone, their recorded statements asking for returns, curators quietly calling lawyers. Because I had leaked the journalistic packet at the exact second the hash verified, legal teams were already drafting subpoenas and conservators were arranging emergency provenance panels for museums. The power of it felt like the final bell of a game you know you have already won. People began to chant softly at first, then louder, "Who made this? Who made this?" It was no longer Jamie's audience. It was a crowd trying to reconcile truth with their appetite for stories they had been sold. Influencers shoved their phones in the air, eager to snag the moment their feeds would mutiny into a narrative of accountability. Jamie's face went from red to pale as his handlers realized sponsors were polling their PR teams and that dollars were already trending away. My parents covered their faces, and then, in a slice of humanity I hadn't expected, my mother reached out and touched my hand on my sleeve. It shook slightly. For a second, I caught the ghost of the kid she had once praised for being useful, and I felt something like pity, like the soft part of victory. I finished by saying a line I'd written in the margins of my first sketchbook: "Hands matter." It was a small sentence that landed big. The projection on the pavilion changed one last time, the spiral resolving into my initials in a way anyone could screenshot and tweet. The world saw the mark that had been invisible for decades glowing in public for the first time, and for the first time the shape of a lie became the outline of a legal and moral case. Jamie mouthed, "That's not fair," but fairness had nothing to do with it anymore. The crowd had seen the fingerprints. The collectors held their keys. The internet had found its new story, and I was finally standing where the light could not be misdirected. The moment the last image hit the feeds, the world unspooled faster than any PR playbook could catch. Sponsors texted cease and desist notes while their brand lawyers drafted statements. The hotel chain that had plastered Jamie's name on every lobby page canceled their gala and quietly removed the plaque from their flagship location before morning. Galleries called in overnight to confirm provenance and then, one by one, withdrew loans and pulled down press releases. Collectors who had flown across oceans to snap up a Jamie original suddenly found curators and insurers questioning their purchases and asking for the paperwork Jamie had never been able to supply. Where there had once been a glittering roster of investors and smiling endorsements, there were now silence, and the cold clacking of keyboards as people tried to distance themselves from a man whose name had become a legal problem. Jamie did not handle the fall like a man falling. He handled it like a man who had been found standing on the edge of a cliff and then shoved. He tried first to charm his way back into grace, speaking into cameras with hands that had once been taught to sell everything they touched. Then he tried to blame me for the misunderstanding, saying he had been the curator and the steward, that the world had always known there were teams behind big projects. But the emails, the forwarded files, the timestamps and hashes, and the maintenance panel that now sat in 1,000 screenshots told a cleaner story, corroborated by the universities and legal teams I had prepped. The evidence was not elegant. It was forensic, bureaucratic, and impossible to reframe as a collaboration gone awry. Investors froze funds, and within 48 hours Jamie's accounts were under scrutiny. The board of his brand convened emergency meetings and fired the PR agency that had once polished his smile. Journalists who had once fawned over his taste wrote pieces with surgical headlines. There were calls for regulatory inspections, for provenance audits of every item with Jamie's name. A quiet, efficient thing began to happen. Institutions that had built reputations on lending legitimacy quickly took their credibility more seriously. The pavilion itself was cordoned off for inspection. My maintenance panel was removed, cataloged, and photographed, and then those photographs began a new kind of cascade through the media. My parents stopped answering their phones. When they did, their voices were thin, like paper left in a rainstorm. My mother left a message that started with "I am sorry" and then crumpled into reasons that sounded like defense. My father, who had always folded decisions into maps and insurance, called me and asked if I thought it had gone too far. I told him the truth, which is that there is rarely a clean road to justice. I told him I had wanted only to be known for my work and not to watch someone else profit from my labor for decades. He cried then, and for a moment I heard the frightened child behind the man who had taught me to be useful. It did not undo the years of quiet betrayal. It did not buy back my nights of cold. The offers started like a soft rain and turned into a storm. Museums reached out wanting exhibitions and provenance talks. A mid-sized modern art museum asked if I would curate a show that credited ghost creators across industries. A design school offered me a tenured guest professorship and a studio with funding in exchange for teaching the next generation how to build with integrity. A publisher wanted my first draft for a memoir, and a streaming company offered a documentary crew immediate access, eager to shape the narrative into a season. A tech startup asked if I would join as creative director for a line of ethically made products. People I had never met wrote emails that read like prayers, offering gallery walls, financial support, contracts with actual signatures that matched my name. It would have been easy to take all of it and vanish from the messy center to a comfortable, gilded perimeter. I imagined a bank account unchained from worry and a studio with running heat. I imagined billboards where my name was not a logo but a credit. For a sliver of time, I let myself picture new awards, new shows, the kind of interviews that do not ask about authenticity because they assume it. Then I thought of the kids who came into the community center near my old studio, the ones who used my leftover paints and glued things together with literal hot glue, and a certainty that no one would ever care. I thought of Nina and Theo, who had nothing to gain except a better world for the next person who was told to be useful, and who wanted to make more than a face out of a life. I thought of the small rule I had for myself years ago. When someone reaches for your hand, don't yank it away because you are afraid it will be grabbed. So I said yes to some offers and no to others. I took the museum's show but insisted on it being called something small and blunt, hands. I took the teaching job on the condition that every student in my class would be taught how to claim authorship and given legal resources. I turned down the first big streaming deal because the producers wanted to make Jamie the tragic genius and me the Avenger. I negotiated, I burned, I signed, and I made sure the contracts had the kind of teeth that could not be smoothed over by a PR team. I worked with a lawyer to ensure settlements were not just hush payments, but included credit lines and restitution where possible. We filed a class action against the brand's board for negligence and false representations. Money started to flow not because I chased it, but because the institutions that had been complicit felt the pressure and the need to repair reputations. In the middle of the chaos, there was one quiet moment that felt like real victory. The museum installed the first panel of my show and asked me to sign it. I took a pen and wrote my name in the margin, the same way I had once tucked initials into a seam. I could feel the cameras watching, and for a second every small scar I had earned felt worth the cost. People came to the opening with faces I recognized from the pavilion night and faces I did not. They came with questions and apologies and a hunger to see the hands behind work. Reporters tried to pin me to sound bites about revenge and redemption. I told them what I had always wanted to say: hands matter, credit matters. If you ask someone to be useful, make sure you pay them in truth. Jamie's empire did not implode in a single night into an empty shell. Law takes longer than a tweet storm, but sponsors withdrew and galleries removed his work and his bookings evaporated. In some legal filings, he was accused of fraud. In others, he was defended as a collaborator. He released a statement that read like a half confession and a lot like a plea. I did not send him a message of triumph. I sent him a single photograph of a maintenance panel I had once sealed shut, now cataloged in a museum archive, and wrote under it a line he had once said to me across the kitchen table. We raised him right. I didn't need to add anything. Recognition arrived not as a crown but as a call to work. The offers carried money and space and sometimes regret, but mostly they carried the one thing I had wanted since I was young enough to trace letters into a dining room table, a name attached to work. I stepped out of the shadows by signing my name on that museum panel in a slanted hand, and then by teaching a roomful of kids how to sign theirs. The applause at the opening was not the shallow roar I had once watched from behind curtains. It was quieter and more complicated, and it tasted like a beginning instead of a finish. My life had changed in ways I had only sketched on napkins. In the end, the world finally saw my hands, and I began, for the first time, to build something that belonged wholly to me.